and I want to congratulate you for thriving as well. I've been impressed with the quality of your work so far. As we continue going forward, some weeks are going to be heavier than others. Some will be lighter. I just want you to be aware that there's a little bit more this week than there was last week to do. One thing to remember if you feel a little weighed down with work is that you should try to spend the amount of time that you would normally be in a classroom working on this course, in addition to whatever time you would normally spend doing homework for a brick and mortar class. So maybe that's more of a pep talk to myself than all of you because this is a lot. Keeping up with this course and all my other courses in a purely online format is difficult. So I'm in it with you. I can do it. You can do it. We can all do it. But I do want to emphasize that I think there are some real benefits to being in an online environment. You get to work at your own pace. If you're not feeling it and need to do something else at any given time, go ahead. Do that other thing and come back to this when you're ready. If you another advantage, I guess, of being online is that with your discussion board posts, you can also weigh your words carefully before typing them. That's all harder to do in a physical classroom. There are obviously advantages to being in a physical classroom too. The spontaneous energy of a conversation is something that we don't necessarily replicate, but we do differently in this format. So I do want to repeat, though, that I've been impressed with the focus questions that I've graded so far, and I plan to start going over your discussion board posts as soon as I get these videos up for the week. And I am really looking forward to see how you've all introduced yourselves. I feel like I've only gotten to know a couple of you so far. All right, so for the first two slides, I want to emphasize something that was sort of in the background last week, the idea of the rise of the West. In the early modern period, say the time period between Columbus's voyage and the French Revolution, the West went from being an underdeveloped backwater to a leading center of world power. In large part, now this is still, for some reason, still a contentious claim because of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. Certainly, there were technological and administrative innovations that made this possible as well, but the disproportionate wealth that came from the New World through the exploitation of the souls of Africans and Native peoples was a game changer. And let me be clear, it was also wrong. So what you see in this picture for slide number 2 is a star representing the center of global trade, which in the years between 1492 and say 1750 shifted from the Mediterranean region, the Middle East, to the Atlantic Ocean, meaning that the richest trade routes of the world no longer went through the Middle East. They often went around the Middle East, but the real wealth of the world was going across the Atlantic Ocean between the Americas and Western Europe in particular. So that is my map, but always hard to change. Here we go. But I absolutely love the Gonic illustration on pages 2 and 3. If I was to modify it, and yes, that's one of your focus questions, I'd make African dynamics here a much bigger deal. But I really like the scope of the early modern histories that Gonic covers over the next few pages. It can be a lot to take in, but I think we can do it. So let's switch to slide number 4. Let me get my face out of the way. What do I do with my face? There we go. We'll shrink myself right down. Okay, so last week, a huge turning point that we dealt with was the discovery of the Americas. The first resource that the Spanish exploited in the Americas was gold and silver. At first, they just stole it from natives, but soon they began to build mines, especially at places like the miserable, murderous, high altitude mines in Potosi, in modern day Peru. Potosi would become the primary revenue source for Spain, and Spanish minted silver ended up going all over the world. This caused a global crisis, as the amount of currency in circulation was far greater than ever before. So economies from Kanem Bornu to the Ming Dynasty in China, so Africa to China, from Russia to Zanzibar, they all experienced what's been called the price revolution, with its accompanying great inflation. So basically, for barter economies to evolve into currency-based ones, where an agreed-upon form of money could abstractly represent value, you needed something people agreed was precious. Since gold and silver are rare and shiny and human beings are like raccoons, that worked. But there just wasn't enough of these precious metals to base economies around until the massive pillage of the New World. So, after this influx of gold and silver, economies could specialize better with more access to money than they had been able to before. The disadvantage was that no one really understood how economies worked. So, just adding more money without more labor productivity and product meant that you had inflation. And this inflation ended up spreading around the world. The Great Inflation was a key factor. Where would I put my face? Let's go over here. Was a key factor in bringing down the Ming Dynasty in China, as one example that Gonek also covers in the pages that just zip around the world. I hope you had fun with those pages for the reading this week. So the Ming Dynasty, it had arisen in the 1300s in sort of reaction to previous Mongol rule in China. The Mongols, they were always considered foreigners by Han Chinese elites who arguably caused China and much of Asia to thrive through revitalizing ancient trade routes, but not all Chinese people appreciated that. So the Mongols had a hard time keeping control of China in the aftermath of the Black Plague. So after a period of instability, the Ming Dynasty arose. And in its early years, the empire sponsored adventurers like the amazing, incredible Zhang He, who was contemporaneous with European explorers, people like Henry the Navigator. Zhang He, though, by all accounts, was better. He had bigger ships, better funding. His massive treasure fleets sailed from China around Southeast Asia all the way to East Africa, and they caused both spectacle and disdain in the imperial capital. He once marched an East African giant to the emperor as a present down the street. So the Ming eventually decided to sink his fleet to the bottom of the sea, opting instead to sever foreign alliances and contacts and build a wall. The Great Wall of China, as we know it today, was largely was built under the Ming Dynasty, though there had been earlier walls under earlier dynasties as well. So, despite their initial insularity or isolationism, with time the Ming grew tied into global trade, just like everybody else. Silver coming from the New World across Asian and oceanic trade routes eventually devalued their currency to the point that they too became unstable. And after a period of instability in 1644, Manchus, a non Han Chinese ethnic group, established the Qing dynasty. So Gonek covers this quite well, albeit quickly, in your reading for this week. In a couple of weeks, we'll come back to the Qing relationship to global trade, especially their efforts to control things like illicit drugs. They wouldn't do so well in their fight against British drug dealers, leading to the devastating opium wars, and ultimately the insanely horrifying Taiping Rebellion. But for now, let's leave off with the Ming in China ultimately imploding due to the effects of a global economy that they thought they could control with things like walls and trade barriers. So another one of the areas that Gonek sets up for this week is Japan. He deals with the period when Tokugawa established a rigid form of feudalism, the Tokugawa shogunate, to replace what had been a long period of instability between rival warlords. This shogunate, established at the tail end of the 16th century, like the Ming dynasty, was insular, though more extremely so. Trade was limited to one Dutch ship per year, and like in China, a feudal system emphasized production at home rather than the vagaries of global trade. And like in China, this was successful for a time. This allowed the population of Japan to absolutely skyrocket. So remember, though, that this is the same period of time that a few small European countries like the Netherlands, France, and England were growing fabulously wealthy from the exploitation of slave labor and global trade. In 1868, this shogunate would be replaced by the reestablishment of an emperor, and Japanese people would embark on a breakneck process of modernization, turning themselves into a first rate world power by the end of the 19th century. They did this largely by mimicking the developmentalist and imperialist policies of the European states. And I don't want to glamorize it, it really sucked to be on the receiving end of this Japanese imperialism. So, let's try to switch slides. Nope, sorry. So Gonik ever so briefly deals with the decline of another major empire, the Mughals of India. Last week you read about the powerful gunpowder empires. The Mughals certainly were one of them. At their height, they were an empire that celebrated diversity in a way that so many of us could learn from today. India has always been a diverse region of the world, but the degree to which political units on the subcontinent see diversity as either a source of strength or a liability has varied. And I'm talking diversity in language, religion, ethnicity, cultural beliefs, gender practices for centuries. So, but whether or not Indians have wanted to embrace that or reject it has varied throughout their history. Right now, the current Modi government in India has been quite Islamophobic, for example. At the height of the Mughal Empire, though, India was very much the opposite. Uh, the Mughals themselves were Muslims, but it was their ruler, Akbar the Great. I have a awesome Bollywood picture of someone playing Akbar here. Uh, and his name is actually redundant. Akbar is Arabic for great, so his name was Great the Great. But anyways, Akbar the Great realized that to unify his empire, he should marry a Rajput Hindu princess. As Portuguese traders and missionaries were plying the coast of India, he actually encouraged one of his children to convert to Christianity. He was a scholar who loved to have debates in his court on religion, and he even came up with his own philosophy, Sul el Kul, or peace with all, essentially recognizing that real divine truth transcended human beings' narrow understanding of it. So in his realm, Hindus and Muslims lived in peace, as did the newly emergent Sikh movement, as well as older groups of Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Jewish people, along with both old pre Portuguese contact and new post Portuguese contact Christians. What is so ironic about his reign is that this was the same period that the French wars of religion and ongoing Protestant Reformation wars were ravaging Europe. So it seemed like for a time that India had found a different, better way. But I don't want to overpraise the Mughals. They could be pretty stupid too. It was only decades later that Akbar's great grandson, Aurangzeb, would use Islam as a way to mobilize his forces against Hindu enemies in the south. In the early 1700s, then, the once great Mughal Empire essentially imploded on itself as people followed an intolerant idiot of a leader. Through this infighting, they left themselves disorganized and easy to divide and conquer as Portuguese, French, and eventually, overwhelmingly, British traders began to exploit and carve up the empire. As you read in Gonik, they did this by getting local rulers to turn on each other in return for favors from the European powers. So, this massive destruction of India at the hands of unscrupulous colonialism, as well as willing collaborators locally, would lead to the once prosperous Mughal Empire becoming one of the most impoverished places in the world. Uh, I want to do a little bit of a fun aside. The town that your school is in, Delhi, was named after the capital of the Mughal Empire. India in the late 1700s was still known for its decadence and wealth of trade goods, and that's when our town happened to be named, 1793. Actually, I'm not sure. I'll have to go check the sign. Maybe 1807. Anyways, late 1700s, early 1800s is when Delhi, New York came to be. And one of the founders of Delhi, a man named Ebenezer Foote, decided to name it Delhi to make fun of one of the other founders, Erastus Root, who wanted to name our town Mapleton. And they did this because Root was apparently rather pompous, and people called him the Great Mogul. Mogul is just another way to say Mughal, uh, after after the richness of India behind his back. So and the name has stuck. And we pronounce it Delhi because that was the dominant accent in New York in the early 19th century. We have lots of towns across the east that slightly mispronounce common pronunciations. So we are not Delhi, we are Delhi. Okay, so the people in India, they got destruction and extreme poverty. Well, we in upstate New York stole the name of their capital. A bunch of British dudes, though, got to build fancy houses and have expensive balls while millions of Indians starved for centuries. That's one of the reasons I absolutely can't stand Jane Austen novels or movies. Like, ugh. To try and celebrate the navigation of manners and social norms, which is the whole theme of these novels, while ignoring the broken backs and murder of millions of slaves and colonized people who afforded these characters their luxurious, indolent lifestyles, just kind of drives me crazy. So, your reading then shifts to the Atlantic slave trade. And all right, maybe I just stay out of this frame. I had a hard time with pages 15 through 17 of this week's readings. I get that it's difficult to capture raw trauma in any form of art, but using slapstick, that didn't work for me, except as a way to set up the excellent frame in the middle of page 18 that I'm showing you right here. So when we celebrate the ideas and values of Western civilization, however we imagine them, we have to remember that those who allowed for the leisure time necessary to come up with these things, especially in the age of enlightenment. And we must remember the debt that is owed them. And part of that debt should include problematizing our philosophies by trying to include the voices of those who for centuries were forced into silence. What Gonick does well, though, is to then outline those heroic efforts to outlaw first the slave trade, then slavery in England and English colonies. And I should pause here just to, if you can't read this slide, what you see is this is supposed to be a slave pointing to his dead friends, saying, "Look on the bright side. We're giving the Brits the leisure to develop liberal philosophy." So the ideas and methods of English resistors to this, to slavery, would have a tremendous impact on the transnational, especially transatlantic, efforts to eventually abolish slavery as well. And that's an aspect of Western liberal thought that included lots of black voices too, that I think we can all be proud of. So I also want to emphasize, let me, come on, that there was never unanimous, where can I put myself over here by there was never unanimous consensus anywhere in the world that slavery was okay. There were heroes fighting against it anywhere and everywhere it's ever been. When you sometimes hear people say, "Well, that's just the way it was back then," sure, but people didn't accept, wrong. Wrong is wrong in any period. So these people who resisted slavery, they're the real reason that it's not legal anywhere in the world today. That's not to say it doesn't still exist, and certainly we can all draw inspiration from the heroes of the past and ongoing struggles against slavery and oppression in any form. But in the period we're covering, many Christians in particular refuse to blindly follow supposed Christian justifications for slavery. Muslims too, as I mentioned earlier, also used Islam as a reason to resist slavery. So the Christianity of these nonconformists, though, was instead going to be about actually following the anti-establishment revolutionary ideas of Jesus Christ. Doing so made these people seem a bit crazy. Nonconformists who emerged in England in the 1600s were numerous by the 1700s and included groups like Quakers, Methodists, and evangelicals. They opposed the pursuit of profit for profit's sake and worried about the oppression of the poor, which they felt to be incompatible with their religious beliefs. One of these people, John Newton, was a former slave ship captain who converted to evangelical Christianity and wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which is prominent among English speaking, actually among lots of Christians all over the world today. So in 1781, there was a particularly ugly example of the disregard for human life that came when slavery was mixed with modern economics. The Zong was the name of a slave ship that got lost on its way to Jamaica. In order to make sure they didn't run out of supplies while lost, crew members threw 130 slaves overboard before reaching their destination. The owners of the ship then attempted to collect insurance payments on their lost property. Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp found out about this and pushed for the owners of the ship to be tried for murder. The egregiousness of this example mobilized people against slavery. What the ship crew and company did was perfectly legal. and yet it was so obviously morally wrong. They were never tried for murder, but also they never received insurance payments for the people they murdered. So mobilization against the Zong owners would be essentially the catalyst to create the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. One of the founding members of that society, I'm not going to put my face in here, I was not a founding member of that society, uh, and some of their other members are listed here too, but one of the founding members, Olaudah Equiano, had previously formed a group known as the Sons of Africa, made up largely of freed American slaves who had gone to England after the American Revolution. These people were promised and granted their freedom for escaping to British lines during the war. As an eloquent former slave himself, Equiano showed the British public that Africans were people too, and importantly, mobilized the voices of former slaves against slavery, essentially putting to death the myth that slaves enjoyed their state, that they were being taken care of. So Equiano was also a founding member of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which used methods like boycotts, especially of sugar, and newspaper editorials to eventually convince Parliament that slavery was both immoral and unprofitable. In 1807, England abolished the slave trade and abolished slavery in all of its colonies by 1822. Others listed here, like Granville Sharp and William Wilberforce, uh, used legal means to oppose slavery, eventually succeeding in banning the slave trade. Thomas Clarkson tried to show that it was more profitable to do business with Africans than it was to destabilize their governments for the sake of obtaining ever more slaves. So when you think of the Enlightenment, you probably, I'll put myself in here, I'll be an enlightened thinker, David Hume and me. But when you think of the Enlightenment, you probably think of an era devoted to progress, science, rational philosophies, and a belief in the potential of humanity. What's a little ironic is that so many absolutists, or totalitarian, to use a more 20th century term, rulers were fans of the Enlightenment. In their minds, science and progress were all good, provided that they made rulers more, not less powerful. But starting in the late 17th century in the British Isles, among other places, you had thinkers who argued that the Enlightenment needed to include rights as well, what John Locke would call natural rights. So, in Locke's writings on the social contract, he argued that humanity once lived in a state of nature. He was building on Thomas Hobbes' ideas, where they had total freedom. But because they had the freedom to do anything, there was really no freedom at all because everyone was a victim of everyone else's whims. Governments emerged then as people gave up only those rights which would increase the liberty of everyone else. This is the idea of the social contract. So you lose your right to rob and murder, for example, but thereby gain a right to live and have possessions. When he wrote the English Bill of Rights in 1688, he argued that government had a duty to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. This idea is the intellectual origin of classical liberalism. Another prominent Scottish thinker was David Hume, who became known for, among other things, a reinvigoration of the old Greek idea of skepticism. The way he reimagined it, one should not take anything for granted, but question everything. This becomes key to political ideas like the divine right of kings, to which Hume would respond, says who? Hume's ideas really invited intellectuals and eventually broader populations to question the world as they saw it. The 18th century became, in many parts of the world, an exciting intellectual atmosphere where people felt free to imagine entirely new social and political orders. Those imaginings would have the most impact, early on at least, in one of the more oppressive places to live. I can't put myself in with these. Here, I'll put myself over there. In the 1700s, which was France. Here, people like Rousseau built on Locke's ideas and argued that governments had a duty to do the most good for the most people. Rousseau's idea of doing things for the greater good would gain, and probably still has, a nasty connotation as it became a later justification for the terror during the French Revolution. Rousseau, in his defense, didn't live to see that, and I think Gonek plays up his guilt a bit too much. He died 11 years before the French Revolution began. Another French philosopher, Montesquieu, argued that different government types have different virtues and are better for different kinds of people. Naturally, absolutist leaders used his ideas to argue that their government type was best for their people. Then you had Voltaire, who was light-hearted yet profound, in the vein of modern day political comics. Well, one of his major contributions was that liberalism could only work with tolerance, that tolerance of, especially religious differences, was crucial to a successful Republican form of government. So, with all of these liberal ideas in the background, uh, American colonists were able to frame their dispute over rather minor taxes with Great Britain as something far more grand. No taxation without representation captured the idea from the English Bill of Rights that government couldn't act without the consent of the governed. That idea brought some to the patriot cause, but what brought a lot more people over to the cause of rebellion was the intellectual ferment seen in documents like the Declaration of Independence and earlier in 1776 Thomas Paine's Common Sense. These were very clear in layman's tongue explanations of what liberalism was and how rights should be worked, to the point that by 1776, so many people fighting in the American Revolution really did have an idea of creating sort of a blank slate where they could work out a more a more enlightened form of society. And that is such a controversial and contentious thing to say, too, because there are so many examples that undermine that. But with eventual French, Spanish, Dutch, and Polish assistance, Americans would win their independence from Britain. The American Revolution would become an experiment in liberalism, and it's ongoing. Uh, by the way, if you vote in November, I will give you 5 extra credit points on your first paper. If you're not eligible to vote, like if you're too young or if you're not a citizen of the United States, I will give you 5 extra credit points if you promise me that you'll vote whenever or wherever you're eligible to vote. And that means you need to make yourself eligible to vote. You need to register. So, some of the thinkers that emerged out of the American Revolution. Nah, I can't put myself over Hamilton. That had profound impacts on other liberal movements in the world are listed here, mainly as ideal types of the kinds of ideas that came out of the American experience. You had Jefferson, whose ideas on infusing a republic with democracy meshed well with the liberal aspirations of much of the world. He was also a physiocrat who believed in wealth based on agricultural production. His role in drafting the Declaration of Independence and eventual Constitution cemented his position in the history of classical liberalism. He's also remembered, among other things, for his statements on the freedom of the press. Most of you are probably aware that his history of slave owning complicates much of this legacy. John Adams has been remembered for his insistence on the rule of law, especially the need for a continuation of English common law. He believed in the need for a strong federal government and was suspicious that democracy, taken too far, could produce the kind of mob rule he felt to be present in the French Revolution. Then you've got Alexander Hamilton, who really pioneered the idea of a government that could provide support for a society built on the new ideas of capitalism, which we'll talk about that a lot later in class. So finally, for the revolution to succeed, uh, it seems you needed, like so many revolutions before and since, a person around whom a cult of personality could be built. That farmer and slaveholder of good manners, martial prowess, and solid Republican sentiments was George Washington, a modern American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a Roman farmer and senator who became dictator in time of need, then returned to his farm when the emergency was over, rather than seizing power for himself as Julius Caesar would later do. Washington led the Continental Army and was the first president of the United States, and to many people then and since, he's an all around Paul Rudd type of nice guy. And I did not mean to just imply that Paul Rudd is a slaveholder. Paul Rudd's a nice guy. So, shortly after the war for American independence was over, switching slides, the French Revolution began. Some of the key causes that feature in most histories of the French Revolution are listed on this slide. A big one was France's debt, accumulated over a century of nasty wars, mostly with England, the most recent of which was the American Revolution. In 1788, to be able to better collect taxes, Louis XVI decided to convene an ancient medieval assembly called the Estates General that hadn't convened for over 150 years. The Estates General split the population according to feudal categories: the nobility, clergy, and third estate, or peasants. What the king didn't expect was that the third estate would take this so seriously. They also represented the majority of the population. So, over the months between his announcement and the time when the estates were to meet, peasants, often aided by clergy, collected complaints in complaint boxes, cahiers de doléances, and began to view this meeting not as a way to help raise taxes, but as a way to have a say in their government. The king grew alarmed when the peasants tried to meet before the official meeting in June of 1789. He locked them out of the assembly hall, so they instead met at a nearby tennis court. There, under the leadership of Joseph Emmanuel Sieyès, who had previously written a tract arguing that since the peasants made up the majority of the population, they should have the majority of votes in the estates. Uh, so there, under his leadership, they signed the Oath of the Tennis Court, really the first revolutionary act, basically vowing to meet together whenever, wherever, until they were the legitimate governing assembly of France. Peasant uprisings then started almost immediately, mostly attacking landlords' estates and burning any paper that mostly illiterate people thought might be a contract. The storming of the Bastille was a symbolic act of revolution 1 month later, July 14th, and by August, the Assembly was meeting regularly and had published its own revolutionary document that is also a foundation of liberal theory, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They abolished special privileges for nobility and began to function as a governing assembly in conjunction with a monarchy. The comic on this page, this is supposed to be a comic, shows how life was before the revolution. You've got the peasant here carrying the nobility and the clergy on his back, while a rabbit that he's not allowed to hunt right here is eating his cabbage. And in the next slide, you see what the revolution has done. Instead, it's the peasant getting to ride on the back of the nobility. The clergy, they weren't necessarily that bad. They didn't need to be sat upon. Clapping as he's about to go eat that rabbit that's been messing with his crops. And look how nice this head of cabbage is, totally unaffected by pests. So, well, the American Revolution set an important precedent. It was really the ideas of the French Revolution, in part because of Napoleon's later expansionism, that would transform the world. Within a few decades, French inspired revolts were occurring with regularity all over the world, and you could argue that the next more than 100 years would be the long century of revolutions. Eric Hobsbawm actually did that, wrote a whole book on it, and many others have too. So, one nice way to capture how the revolution transformed society is with the idea of the transformation of subjects into citizens. It's basically a subject is one who is acted upon, but a citizen acts. A citizen has a share in what the government does. To accomplish this, French revolutionaries imagined the nation to be an ethnic whole. There was a book that came out almost 40 years ago by Benedict Anderson that argued that after the French Revolution, people around the world began to imagine nations and imagine ethnicities as sharing something common, something timeless and essential. The idea then was that France would become a nation state, a country where everyone was the same and proud to be French. It's really the French Revolution is the birth of nationalism as a force in the world. One institution that accomplished this better than others was the Army, or National Guard as it was called. When the French Revolution got underway, France was still at war with enemies like Prussia and Austria. To be able to continue fighting these wars while carrying out governmental change at home, revolutionaries decided to have a levée en masse, or a conscription, of all unmarried, able bodied men between the ages of 18 and 25. There were no exceptions for the nobility. In the army, everyone was pooled together, and here they became one united French people. They learned to read and write, to speak a standardized version of French, to appreciate French culture and histories, to appreciate the flag, and to begin to see themselves not as residents of their villages or regions, but as something larger, as French. This idea of nationalism would spread like wildfire across the world over the next century and be both an inspiration and a catalyst to numerous bloody wars. So, while the new government was quite popular at the end of 1791, 2 years after the revolution, revolutionaries couldn't leave well enough alone and continued, especially within the assembly, to advocate for more radical change. The political parties that emerged were the people of the mountain, the Girondins, who advocated for slow change, the Jacobins, who were more radical, and the sans culottes, like this dude pictured here, which is, it means no breeches. Apparently, if you were lower class, you just wore normal pants instead of, big goofy looking breeches like rich people at the time wore. So, being sans culottes was a way to show your street cred as the most radical of the groups. One of the early moves that alienated people from the revolution was an attempt by the assembly to nationalize the Roman Catholic Church, meaning that the state would appoint clergy rather than Rome. The state feared the power of the church, but in trying to counter it, violated people's right to faith as a private affair. The eventual Vendée uprising in the countryside against the revolution would be motivated in large part by faith. So in 1792, the king fled and became a prisoner, eventually being executed. In late 1792, in protest of prices, people stormed the assembly, and a coalition of Jacobins and sans-culottes gained power. And the next January, the Committee of Public Safety was formed, with Robespierre at its head. Creepy dude. Over the next year and a half, he executed 40,000 people as enemies of the revolution. This period of terror turned many in the US and Britain against the revolution. An additional 40,000, largely civilians, were killed in the Vendée uprising. Robespierre went so far as to nationalize Notre Dame and create his own church, the cult of the Supreme Being, to replace Catholicism in France. He was eventually guillotined in the Thermidorian reaction, named after the month Thermidor, or July. Revolutionaries did some radical things like remake the weeks and months and even implemented the metric and Celsius systems of measurements. So things were really relatively peaceful for the next 4 years until the rise of Napoleon. So Napoleon was a successful general, or at least a general who knew how to play up his successes and misrepresent his deeds as victories, like the failed Egyptian campaign where he abandoned his army to return to Paris as a hero. Through coups and intrigues, he followed in the footsteps of Julius Caesar, as he got appointed first consul of the Republic, then first consul for life, then eventually Emperor of France. In English speaking countries, he's often remembered as a dictator. England was his biggest foe, and the US, as part of the English speaking world, with Federalists at the time who essentially agreed with the English, um, largely adopted this negative view of him. In so much of the rest of the world, though, even in Russia, where he found his eventual defeat, he's remembered for spreading the ideas of the revolution. When Napoleon conquered somewhere, he set up local assemblies, gave people the right to vote, encouraged nationalism, encouraged people to use their own local languages and traditions, and joined people to the successful French continental economic system, which was an economic union that was largely successful as a way to counter British economic prowess. So when Napoleon's Grande Armée marched against Russia in 1812, it was made up of 500,000 mostly non-French people, especially Poles, German speakers, Italians, Slavs that didn't even have agreed upon names for themselves yet. Slovenes, for example, they didn't call themselves that yet. They usually called themselves Illyrians or Corinthians. So when Napoleon was finally defeated, he was exiled to the island of Ebla, and escaped, rose again, rose another army, and had to be defeated one last time. When he was finally defeated at Waterloo, he left a good memory for many in Europe, for ordinary people across Europe and the Middle East, and much of North Africa. And he also, and obviously, we'll talk next week about his tremendous legacies in Central and South America, as well as Haiti. But he also left a memory of terror for the monarchs of Europe. So, very briefly, when Napoleon was finally defeated, the Congress of Vienna was the treaty among the monarchies of Europe that rearranged the borders of what he had conquered and established a new order based on unified resistance to revolutions and an understanding that states should keep a balance of power with each other, and that states would have a willingness to intervene in other European states to stop future revolutions. That was called the Troppau Protocol. So I outlined a couple of interesting tidbits on this slide. So the final two slides are the final yeah, this second to last slide, I mean, show the long-term effects of Napoleon. Europe in 1815 was made up of empires and disunited German and Italian states. I hope you can see that this map is different, not just because one has names written on it. Um, so, due to the pressure of nationalism over the next 200 years, Germany and Italy would unify. Look, just one country. Well, there's more than one country that speak German. And empires would slowly come apart, most recently in 2012 when Montenegro, down here in Crna Gora, separated from Serbia. I should probably have a map here that goes farther east too to show the Donbass region of Ukraine, which is in rebellion, and that Crimea is part of Russia now. But the nationalism is a powerful force for redrawing and making political maps look different. So after Europe, I do want to briefly talk about Haiti as well, as it's in your readings. So the first revolution that can be tied to the French is the revolt that occurred in France's colony of Saint-Domingue. When the French Revolution began in 1789, there was already a series of revolts occurring on the French half of the island. When the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen was published in August, it reached Saint Domingue within weeks, and despite widespread illiteracy among slaves, its ideas spread like wildfire. The idea that all men are free naturally made slaves say, what about us? Slave owners tried to assure their slaves that the ideas didn't apply to them, but that didn't really quell the infectious fire of these ideas. What made the revolt what made the revolt on what would become Haiti far more successful than the Pugachev revolt that oh sorry okay sorry what made the revolt on Haiti successful was the idea that it had the legitimacy of an idea, a philosophy of liberalism that could not be compatible with slavery, though many countries across the world would try to combine the two. One person who came to lead the rebellion was Toussaint Louverture. This is a great book. My face in the way. This is a great book by C.A. Bailey that features this wonderful painting of Louverture on the cover. But he was a literate, free black man with extraordinary charisma and military skills. In Haiti, so many of the slaves were recently brought from Africa. One of the sickening facts about the Caribbean is that most slaves were newly captured, as few lived for long in the horrifying plantation conditions. What that meant is that the slaves in Haiti came from destabilized regions of West and Central Africa and came with a lot of military experience. They knew how to fight, and with proper organization and inspiration, the French couldn't deal with them. In 1794, the French recognized Haitian autonomy. When Napoleon tried to rein them in after 1802, the Haitians, ready to defend their independence, fought back, creating clever alliances with the Spanish and English as well. In 1804, their independence was recognized by France, which by then had given up most of its claims to the Americas, including agreeing to the Louisiana Purchase, which would transform the young United States of America. So you could argue that without the Haitian Revolt, the Louisiana Purchase may have never happened. But the idea that slaves could form an independent republic was inspirational across the Americas. It inspired the Spanish speaking colonies, gave hope to slaves everywhere, and scared the living daylights out of slave owners across the Western Hemisphere, who did everything they could to destabilize, delegitimize, and isolate Haiti, giving the country a long, difficult road to travel. But in the 19th century, the uprising in Haiti especially inspired slave revolts in the United States, like the German Coast Uprising, along with a harshening of attitudes towards slaves. So that is a lot to cover, uh, but hopefully this is all workable for you, and I'd like to give you a chance now to take a swipe at some of these bonus questions. So hopefully you can just pause as you go in between. I have them on two separate pages. And just so you know, I also put a non-narrated version of this PowerPoint on Banco Hall for you to be able to access whenever you want. So, all right, thank you all. And as always, please reach out to me if you have any questions or if anything's unclear. And I'm happy to go over stuff with you. I have office hours every morning from 9 to 10 at my Zoom link. All right, good luck.